kinds of stuff done to them, right? 9095, the alien property custodian. Now, what would you think that is from that name? Alien property. What kind of aliens are we talking about?
Foreign.
Foreign, not just confiscating some Martian's flying saucer. So what the alien property custodian was, it's slightly related to 9066 in this way. The Japanese were rounded up, Japanese American citizens, or American citizens of Japanese descent, were rounded up and put in concentration camps because they were suspected of harboring feelings favorable to Japan, which was an enemy. Now notice, I phrase that carefully. Suspected of having thoughts.
It turned out that they weren't, of course.
Turned out that they weren't. They weren't actually aiding Japan in any way, shape, or form. 9095, American citizens were doing business with Nazi Germany during wartime. Profiting. I'm not just selling cuckoo clocks. Tanks, bomb fuses,
Ford Motor
phones, computers, substantial aid for the German war effort. American citizens were doing that. That's considerably more than the Japanese were doing, which wasn't even having the thought. These folks were actually doing it. So here's what happened. The president signs an order which basically says, okay, we can take, because we're at war, we can take the enemy side of a joint German-American business venture. We can take the German side. But the American side remains intact. We can't confiscate that. Now, that didn't destroy the company, naturally, because the American side is probably the side that had the most influence and was still making the most money and still trading with the enemy. So notice they didn't stop them from trading with the enemy. They just took the German side. Alien property custodian. Right? All right, so that includes companies so affected: IBM, Ford Motors, General Motors, ITT Siemens, which still, all these companies still exist. DuPont, the chemical company, Standard Oil of New Jersey, which is Chevron, Davis Oil Company, Union Bank, Chase National Bank. Doing business with Nazi Germany. All right, so Henry Ford, Ford Motor Company. Just in case this appears on a midterm or final near you. Ford Motor Company, not Volkswagen. Ford Motor Company won the highest civilian award from Nazi Germany. Hitler had a picture of Ford on his desk. Not because he wrote a book called The International Jew, but because he supplied Nazi Germany with jeeps and tanks.
Well, not only that, but his manufacturing system that he set up was used
Yes.
by them to run their war machine manufacturing.
Yeah, you're referring to the assembly line.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Assembly line techniques.
Yeah. All right. Sosthenis Ben, who's president and founder of ITT, won the highest civilian award for service to his country, that is the United States. ITT built the German phone and radio communication systems and altitude bomb fuses. I suppose if somebody wanted to check whether ITT Siemens is now T-Mobile, that would be interesting.
And they have some Siemens machine in Portland.
Yeah, Siemens makes all kinds of electronics and other things. Elevators, control switches.
Siemens next door.
Yeah. So the double standard. So 9066, imprisoned American citizens in concentration camps. Homes, businesses, and other property were confiscated. They're loaded on the trains with only the belongings they could carry. This is done because they're suspected of being sympathetic to the enemy, though there was no evidence that they were. And so none sent money, material, or lobbied in support of Japan. So according to the historical record, there were 3 people who assembled at Eugene and 3,334 throughout Oregon. When they were sent to the theater on 6th Street, that was two blocks away from the train station, and so there was actually a crowd of people witnessing them being loaded onto trains in Eugene. Haven't gotten a picture from the guard at that time, but have seen eyewitnesses or spoken with eyewitnesses who were there. Same time, German-American Bunds were organized openly. There were numerous Americans who openly did business with Nazi Germany through that presidential order, which licensed trade with the Nazis. Companies that did business with Nazi Germany as well as the U.S., basically renaming them. General Motors, DuPont, etc. Okay, so the president did not block these companies from doing this, fearing low morale or a stock market crash, which is why, if you've never heard of this before this class, that's part of the reason. So some corporate leaders threatened to withdraw aid to the U.S. if Roosevelt revealed the arrangement. The Secretary of State blocked aid to German Jewish refugees because the U.S. wasn't supposed to be trading with the enemy, except the Jews were fleeing Germany. They're not technically the enemy. So, Ford's book was said to inspire Hitler's Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Another little detail, Port Chicago mutiny. So here's what that was. So this is part of the African American experience during wartime. We haven't even gotten into the basic, the deal around, though I mentioned Camp Van Dorn earlier, where 1,200 black soldiers were murdered on U.S. soil by other soldiers for essentially racial insubordination, where they said, look, we're American citizens, we can walk down the street, we can do other things, we don't have to be discriminated against in our own country while wearing our own country's uniform. No, we're sending you to Mississippi and then you're being disappeared, which is what happened. Part of that experience translated to Port Chicago. The U.S. Navy built Port Chicago, which is an ammunition base located in northeast of San Francisco, for the loading of shipping of ammunition to U.S. troops fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. If you've seen the movie Battleship or any war movies, these are shells for the 4 and 16-inch guns. Basically, they have a range of 20 plus miles, used for land targets, high explosive, and these are live, ready to explode, right? Ready to be shot and explode. So, during segregation in the military, not only did they have separate black and Japanese military units commanded by white officers, they often had blacks doing menial jobs like cooking or cleaning up or being busboys or, in this case, loading these munitions. So all the sailors loading the munitions were black, and the officers commanding them and overseeing them while loading were white. So it's basically like slavery, except within the military. Meals and quarters were segregated with all whites eating first and then blacks. So no training had been given to the loaders or the officers supervising, and the Navy didn't even have written guidelines for loading munitions onto ships at the time. So remember, these are live ammunition with mines and all these other kind of things that if somebody drops one and it goes off, you could have like a chain reaction. Probably know where I'm going with this if you haven't seen this already. So lack of official training meant that men had to learn on the job without gloves. So remember, this is in the hot sun during summertime. Sun on metal heats it up, no gloves. You're holding hot, heavy shelves.
It's hot out there. It's
with no gloves.
It's not like San Francisco. It's like 100 degrees out there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it is. Right? With no other safety precautions, with your white officers betting on whose crew could finish fastest and basically yelling orders for you to, do things that probably would not be safe. So, these methods led to improper handling of the explosives, like rolling live shells down gangways to be caught with bare hands, and eventually, of course, disaster. So this is a ship. If you ever take the Coast Starlight from here, Eugene down to Oakland, what you will see is what's referred to as the Liberty Fleet, which is basically ships like this that were being loaded with supplies for the Pacific Fleet. This particular ship is one of the ships that was, this is a picture taken before the accident. So 10 p.m. on July 17th, 2 munition ships, the E.A. Bryant and Quinault Victory, blew up while being loaded with bombs, shells, and depth charges. 2 terrific explosions rocked the base. Now imagine basically the force of the explosion. It essentially vaporized the ship. Force of the blast were equivalent to 5 kilotons of TNT. Same order of magnitude as the atomic bomb that would be dropped in Hiroshima. Everyone on the pier and aboard the 2 ships were killed instantly, naturally. About 320 men, 202 of whom were black. Another 390 military personnel and civilians injured, including those 202 black enlisted men. The biggest home front disaster of World War II, and resulted in 15% of all black casualties sustained during World War II, right at this one event in peacetime. So this is a picture of basically the aftermath. So the next day, the black soldiers were ordered to search the wreckage for bodies. Many of the victims, of course, couldn't be identified because if the ships were vaporized, what's it going to do to a body? Carnage was indescribable. After the disaster, a Navy court of inquiry cleared all the white officers of any responsibility in the disaster. The court placed blame on the black loaders, saying rough handling of munitions by individuals may have caused the explosion. Its conclusion did not take into account the lack of training the loaders had been provided from other officers, which was no training at all. No safety gloves, nothing. So traumatized, the loaders, 258 ammunition loaders, all of them black, refused to return to work, considered too dangerous for white sailors. They were interned on a barge until they went to work with basically in the hot sun. So they weren't actually refusing to work. They were basically refusing to work without gloves and safety training, which the Navy refused to provide. And basically the Navy's position was you're disobeying orders. So therefore, mutiny. Hence, Fort Chicago mutiny. So 208 sailors went back to work, 50 still refused, and so they went on trial for mutiny. And then if you can see in the Chicago Defender, so the Chicago Defender is a black newspaper out of Chicago, says 8 killed in new Navy blast. So there were subsequent explosions at Navy yards after that. "50 seamen who refused to return to work were court-martialed, convicted of mutiny, and imprisoned until the end of the war. In the divided America of World War II, their plight outraged blacks and white liberals, including a young NAACP lawyer named Thurgood Marshall. He was present at the trial and voiced frustration of the anger of the men of the trial. He said, quote, 'This is not 50 men on trial for mutiny. This is the Navy on trial for its whole vicious policy towards Negroes. Negroes in the Navy don't mind loading ammunition. They just want to know why they're the only ones doing the loading. They want to know why they are segregated. They also want to know why they're forced to work without safety equipment or instructions.' So aftermath, with the help of the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall's persistence, the sentence of 50 black sailors was significantly reduced but not overturned. Ultimately, the action of the sailors helped change the face of the Navy. Soon, white soldiers were put to work side by side with black soldiers loading ammunition at Port Chicago. Later, again, in part to Thurgood's influence and the NAACP pressure, the Navy began desegregating. In 48, when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, so notice the numbering again, not that, maybe I should put this on final too, just to change things up. Ordering an end to racial segregation in the armed forces. So the Navy was already in compliance. But 50 years later, the sentences still stood, though Clinton, as he was leaving this presidency, was said to have pardoned their sentence. Many of them were dead, of course, but mighty white of them to pardon them after the war. Tuskegee Airmen, getting a lot of attention from the movies, both the HBO one, Tuskegee Airmen of the same name, and Red Tails. In case this appears on a midterm or final near you, understand this. Who the Tuskegee Airmen were, because it was the Army was segregated, and many flight schools were, of course, segregated. Black people who wanted to learn to fly had to get their training from Canada or Europe. Now, the way that enlistment usually worked, just like you have never known a draft, but during this time there was a draft, so people could get drafted as early as high school. These folks had college degrees. All of them, right? So they're not teenagers. So racial exclusion policies, full force. So General Arnold made it clear that, quote, no blacks would ever pilot a plane in the upcoming war. This is before the war broke out. The United States was mobilizing for a possible war against the United Front of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they would need pilots for air support. Right? So the Army, this general, made it clear that blacks were basically inferior and unfit to fly airplanes, particularly to fly fighter airplanes. So the Tuskegee Airmen was an experiment by the Army to prove blacks could not fly in combat. That was their specific intention. So if a question comes up about, from the point of view of the Army, what was the Tuskegee Airmen to prove? That blacks couldn't fly. From that point of view, the experiment failed. Of course it failed. Racism isn't rational. So legal segregation of African Americans did not allow them to receive the necessary training to become fighter pilots at white-operated pilot schools. So after some protests, the War Department in 41 agreed to accommodate an all-black flight school at Tuskegee Air Force Base in Alabama. Now the idea was, again, okay, we'll give this to you, but you're going to fail because you people are inferior. You don't have the right reflexes or the brain power. Never mind, all of them are college graduates at the time that they're at the time they join this particular flight school. Not only are they all college graduates, but they're all pilots, recognized in Europe and in Canada.
Same what happened with the profile soldier in the World War II. They gave them mission, they never come back.
Right.
So they didn't send them like...
Which soldiers?
Buffalo soldiers.
Buffalo soldiers, yeah.
Spanish
Right.
American.
Right, in the Spanish-American War, right. Okay, so that base at Tuskegee produced the first American combat fighter pilots, also known as the Tuskegee Airmen of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, etc. So out of the squadron came Colonel Benjamin Davis, son of the first African-American general, Benjamin O. Davis. Colonel Davis was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in combat, later promoted to general in 65. This is the Tuskegee Airmen, trained and reluctantly sent to North Africa after the intercession of the First Lady. This was detailed in Tuskegee Airmen movie, where basically the First Lady visited the air base and asked to be taken up in an airplane with one of the airmen, and then asked why they weren't being used in theater, that is, combat. Right? Signed to bomber escort. They didn't lose a single bomber to enemy fighters, or maybe a couple of bombers, depending on who you believe. The original Black Panthers, 761st Tank Battalion, all-black tank division, signed to the 26th Infantry of Patton's 3rd Army. He specifically requested them. They went into battle in France in 1944. Normally, tank squadrons are rotated off after a month or two of combat. These folks remained in continuous combat for 6 months, 183 days. They also participated in the liberation of at least one death camp, Auschwitz. And receiving medals. So they're not mentioned in the Patton movie in Hollywood. So, let's see. We talked about Camp Van Dorn already. All right. Victory in Europe, victory in Japan. So, we won, that is, what do we mean by we? We fought for freedom and democracy. With valor and honor at great cost, we put our differences to side. So when we hear about African American participation in war before this class or other than movies, is that usually part of your historical training? Generally not. So war movies, like Battle of the Bulge, Fighting Leathernecks, Patton, Saving Private Ryan, where we were there even if we weren't in the movies. So just like when Billie Holiday sang about strange fruit, just like World War I, black soldiers returned to America only to be lynched in uniform. Paul Robeson did concert tours to raise money for the troops. He and Albert Einstein, asked President Truman to make a public statement against lynching of soldiers, which he refused to. Truman refused, suggesting Robeson was a communist for even raising the issue. Getting to locally Eugene. Eugene was typical. If you're a soldier of color, you could not buy the home of your choice wherever you wanted in Eugene. You could not even buy a house within the city limits. Discrimination was perfectly legal. Before, when I talked last term about the Harlem Renaissance, Ho Chi Minh wrote a paper against lynching in the time of the Harlem Renaissance when he was meeting with Marcus Garvey. And he was basically protesting Vietnamese independence, not protesting, but proclaiming Vietnamese independence on September 2nd, 1945, starting with the quoting Thomas Jefferson, because the Vietnamese essentially, if I go back for a second, the Vietnamese have been fighting for 800 years. First against the Chinese, 200 years against the French. Then the French handed over their colony without a fight to the Japanese during World War II. The Vietnamese fought the Japanese and won. So with the defeat of the Japanese by the US among others, September 2nd, Ho Chi Minh declares independence. Finally, after 800 years. And here's how he does it. All men are created equal. They are endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sound familiar? Well, it should. It's Thomas Jefferson. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the people have a right to live, to be happy and free.
That's quite ironic that he would say that when at the time he said it, only people that own property could vote. And, a lot of people were excluded from being equal.
Yes. Well, Ho Chi Minh is basically poetically interpreting Thomas Jefferson's words, because Jefferson didn't mean that. But Ho Chi Minh can be excused by saying, this is what he actually means in 1945.
Axiology.
Yeah, his axiology, right. The Declaration of the French Revolution made in 1791 on the rights of man and the citizen also states, all men are born free with equal rights and must always remain free and have equal rights. These are undeniable truths. Nevertheless, for more than 80 years, the French imperialists, abusing the standard of liberty, equality, and fraternity, have violated our fatherland and oppressed our fellow citizens. They have acted contrary to the ideals of humanity and justice in the field of politics. They have deprived our people of every democratic liberty. So, if this sounds like Declaration of Independence and the rights of man for Vietnam, you would be correct in thinking that. So, he's basically declaring, look, we're free, recognize us. Well, they wouldn't be doing that. So that was just to set you up for this. This is the late, he wasn't dead at this time, obviously, but in his office, this is the late Senator Hatfield, Senator Mark Hatfield from Oregon. And I interviewed him in his office in Portland, pursuing a lead on a story about Paul Robeson and his connection to Eugene. Because one of the Black community elders thought that he had been brought here by Hatfield, which turned out not to be true when I interviewed Senator. But at Salem High School, he basically told me the story that he organized a concert series, was part of a group that organized a concert series which brought Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson to Salem. And after a stunning concert, Paul was not allowed to stay in the finest hotel in Salem because he was black. And because this happened, Senator Hatfield, who was then young Mark Hatfield, was so embarrassed that he borrowed the family car and personally drove Robeson to the Benson in Portland. During the war, he was at Iwo Jima, that is Hatfield at Iwo Jima, and walked through Hiroshima a couple of days after the bombing. This basically kind of cemented his anti-war stance. So after his return from the war, he worked on the public accommodations bill, which had failed 10 times before that due to the efforts of the owner of that Salem hotel. And in '53, it was finally passed, and he credited his experience with Robeson as part of the reason and his motivation for passing that. Now, this public accommodations bill was the first of its kind in the nation and was passed before such laws were passed in the United States. So the rights of all persons to equal facilities and places of public accommodation. All persons within the jurisdiction of the state shall be entitled to the full and equal accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of any place of public accommodation without any distinction, discrimination, or restriction on account of race, religion, sex, marital status, color, or national origin. Now, the reason you put this into law is because obviously discrimination is happening. I remember being in a place outside of Salem with my family, and someone commented, who was a long-time resident of Salem. She said that the bus station, the Greyhound bus station, had a sign that said, "Welcome to Salem, largest all-white city west of the Mississippi." Which, she said, yeah, the bus station was segregated, so this is kind of thing, when she was growing up, and this was before Hatfield put this into law in 53, and then also amended in 73. So in 53, again, it was before it happened in the United States as a whole, and then amended in 73. Yes?
I was told by some older people that Salem, that's why Portland is a lot of blacks, because they wouldn't let black people stay in Salem. It pushed them to Portland.
It's quite possible. Quite possible. Okay, so now this law did not necessarily grant greater access to housing. So we come to what's referred to as Ferry Street / Tent City, depending on who you are. So here's Paul Robeson. So if it wasn't Mark Hatfield that brought Paul Robeson to Eugene, it was the Sandells, who were a white family interested in civil rights. They were instrumental in bringing Paul Robeson to Tent City. Now, why they were bringing him there was Tent City, or also, it's kind of a misnomer, but they weren't actually tents. It was E-Webb's woodlot, and it was basically a wood-fired plant that boiled steam to generate electricity. And so some of the wood, the excess wood, was being used by people to build houses. Now, at the time, no black people, no people of color could live within the city limits of Eugene unless somebody sold to you, like a white person sold you a house on their own. Some of the laws on the books at the time was, if a real estate agent sold a house in a restricted area, they could lose their license. But if a private person sold the house, there's no law against that. So, no people of color could generally live within the city limits of Eugene before 1965. So those of you who are newcomers who are wondering, okay, why there's no hood? The reason there's no hood is because we weren't allowed to live in the city limits before 1965, when the federal laws made that illegal to discriminate. So what happened was people lived outside the city limits in various places. Now remember, the entire state was founded on the principle of excluding black people, even if they were American citizens, particularly if they were American citizens, from coming to Oregon. So if that's your basic state DNA, then other communities, of course, are going to follow suit. Right? So Portland is still the largest concentration of African Americans if we're just looking at a strictly African American context. Salem's next, Eugene's next, and then the rest of us are scattered all over the place. But in Eugene, since we're talking about Eugene and Lane County, the reason that there's no hood is, one, it was illegal. It was legal for them to discriminate, so type 4 discrimination, institutional racism, and every time one did form, they used the laws or processes like urban renewal to break up the community. So urban renewal is, oh, we got 10 or more black families. I'm not choosing that number lightly. That's the actual history. 10 black families renting in a particular neighborhood. Oh, let's build a senior center. Boom, 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 Campbell Center. The old federal building, boom, boom, boom. Disappeared that. Okay, Glenwood, West 11th, etc. So, north of the city, past where the Ferry Street Bridge used to be. So what the Ferry Street Bridge was, before they built the bridge, there was an actual ferry that carried people across the river to live on the unincorporated lands, which were basically park and agricultural lands. So where Alton Baker Park is and all the car dealerships and the boat dealership, that was all basically undeveloped land. And on the other side of Ferry Street was basically bean fields, which I'll show you in a second.
You knew Willie Nims, right?
I know Willie Mims.
Yeah, didn't his family own a house on this side?
Yeah, well, I'll show you that. His family, he still owns that house.
Yeah,
that
I
house.
just wondered, 'cause I-
So, and he was also a resident of what was referred to as the Ferry Street community, also known as Tent City. So Willie is the one who calls it Tent City. Some other folks like Lily Parker prefer the term Ferry Street because the misnomer is, oh, we didn't live in tents. Well, there is at least one structure that you use a tent to cover over a wooden structure. So Tent City is the community outside the city limits for where close to a century transients had lived, not just black people. So it was home to a thriving, not only African American community, but it was also a mixed race community. Okay, so people of color, of course, were not allowed to live within the city limits of Eugene. And in his only Eugene appearance, Powell sang in the Ferry Street Chapel just before it got bulldozed. Now, he being a civil rights activist, this would be right up his alley, understanding that this community had been here. They had the money to buy houses in town. They weren't allowed to. Their homes were being bulldozed by the county without any, recompense, and also without any provisions being made for them to live within the city limits. So understand, with Einstein and Robeson, they were both anti-racism activists, both of them. And so here's a couple of references for your reading pleasure. If you want to look at Einstein, Race and the Myth of the Cultural Icon, Albert Einstein, Paul Robeson, and Israel by William Loring Katz. And A Cell, the American Campaign to End Lynching. 12 pages of the FBI's Einstein file concern the American crusade to end lynching. You can give it considerably more space than most of his affiliations, because Hoover and his bureau viewed the anti-lynching campaign, much as they would later view the civil rights movement of the 1960s, as a threat to America's national security. I'm trying to see how lynching contributes to national security, unless the preservation of racism is part of national security. Now that makes sense. Perhaps that's true. Einstein's file begins with Army intelligence described by the FBI as a completely reliable source. When in Washington, the delegation planned to call on the White House and national figures to demand action by the administration, that is, to stop lynching. A parade was scheduled to be led by colored and white veterans, to march on the Lincoln Memorial, where a national religious ceremony would be held and persons who escaped lynch mobs were to be presented. Einstein was scheduled to appear. Einstein wrote a letter to Harry Truman assailing lynching. This letter was to be delivered to President Truman by a group headed by Robeson, because Einstein and Robeson were co-chairmen of the ACL. Einstein got sick, and so when his illness prevented him from attending the Washington anti-lynching rally, he sent a letter to be delivered to the president, and apparently Truman refused to meet with them. At the rally, which drew some 3,000 protesters, a multiracial delegation, including Robeson, Rabbi Irving Miller of the American Jewish Congress, Mrs. Harper Sibley, President of the United Council of Churchwomen, and wife of the former president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, met with Truman in the Oval Office. The most detailed accounts found in the African American press about this meeting. Almost as soon as Robeson began reading the group's statement, calling for immediate executive action to stop lynch mobs, the president interrupted. The timing was not yet right for anti-lynching law, he said, and the delegation ought to appreciate the fact that America and Great Britain were the last refuge of freedom in the world. Somewhat less than appreciative, Robeson answered that Britain was one of the world's great enslaver of human beings. Telling the truth, Truman insisted the moment was not propitious for a forthright statement from the chief executive, according to a report from the leading black weekly, the Chicago Defender, which added, in terms which left no doubt in the minds of the delegation for the American Crusade to end lynching, President Truman today emphatically refused to take the initiative to end mob violence and the spread of terrorism in America, declaring the whole question of lynching and mob violence was one to be dealt with in political terms and strategy, and patience must attend the final solution. Okay. Thank you for nothing, Mr. President.
He's from Kansas.
When Mrs. Sibley made a comparison between fascism against the Jews in Europe and fascism in America as levied against Negroes, the president showed impatience and a flare of temper. Robeson said, returning black veterans are showing signs of restiveness, indicating they are determined to get the justice here they have fought for abroad. Robeson warned that this restiveness might produce an emergency situation which would require federal intervention. The president, shaking his fist, stated this sounded like a threat. No, it's just the American vets tend to be gun owners too. And they might shoot back.
And that the President Truman might have his daughter sing instead of Robeson.
Could be.
Yeah.
Robeson's implied ultimatum is that if the American government would not provide protection, black people would defend themselves, was apparently too much for Truman, who promptly ended the meeting. Robeson later told the press his remarks were not a threat, merely a statement of fact about the temper of the Negro people. No, we gonna shoot back. I'm sorry, especially if you trained us to shoot. We will shoot back. We will defend ourselves. Now, what is not told about in the 42 movie with Jackie Robinson is Robeson used his influence to get Branch Rickey to hire Jackie Robinson. And one of the things that Jackie Robinson actually turned on Robeson, which is not portrayed in the movie, but basically Robeson is basically using his platform to say, look, why should we fight against Russia when Russia doesn't lynch us and the Americans lynch us? Why should black people fight for a country that lynches us? Black people will not fight. So Jackie Robinson, well, I don't agree with Paul Robeson. Maybe he's a communist, or words to that effect. There are actually movie clips about that are not portrayed in the movie, because it's all about just baseball, right? And integrating baseball.
Didn't they go after Robinson with the Red Scare?
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
So, in Africa, so when we were talking about the Berlin Conference last term, the Berlin Conference was, in case you don't remember, it was the European colonial powers and America meeting up to divide the dark continent and exploit its resources in the 19th century. So Africans, of course, were not invited. And it's not like Africans are going to sit on their drums while all this is going on. They're organizing. And part of the goal of their organizing, trying to create something that hadn't existed either in the old days or now. Okay, we were colonies. We've gotten rid of the colonizers because they were too busy dealing with Hitler to maintain colonies. So what would a United States of Africa look like? So that was some of the thought going on. So the Pan-African movement basically means the unity of Africans and the elimination of white racial domination from the continent. So Africans are starting to think about this in a number of contexts, So beginning in the diaspora and continuing into the 20th century and thence forming the discourse where Africans in the Caribbean, the Americas, called for solidarity of all African peoples.
Influenced from Du Bois.
Yes, with great influence from Du Bois, among others. So, starting in 1900 in London, called by a Trinidadian lawyer, Henry Sylvester Williams, because a keynote speaker was a white British bishop at this 1900 conference, who at least wanted Africans educated to the level of self-governance. The African-American delegation included Du Bois, Anna Jones, Anna Julie Cooper, who was an African-American woman with a degree from the Sorbonne in France. Ms. Cooper drafted a petition to Queen Victoria outlining a number of injustices that were being promoted by the colonizers against the colonized. Du Bois made the distinction between this conference and the Congress. And the distinction that he made, he basically essentially disses this conference even though he was there, because, okay, why are we having a white bishop being the keynote speaker about African liberation? Why is this? No, let's do our own thing. So, Pan-African Conference and the Pan-African Congresses, which were basically black-led, black keynoted, but still outside of the continent. So 20 years later, directed by Du Bois, 57 delegates from 15 countries, 12 from Africa. The second Pan-African Conference in Brussels, in Paris 2 years later, 113 delegates, 42 from Africa, 35 from the US, 24 from Americans living in Europe, 7 from the West Indies. Third in London and Lisbon, Portugal. Fourth in New York City in 27 during the Harlem Renaissance. Fifth, 1945 in Manchester, England during the war, or just after the war. Du Bois, Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, Amy Ashwood Garvey. The resolutions that they developed there became part of the UN Charter on Human Rights. And also within South Africa. So the African National Congress, the ANC Youth League in 1944 with Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, now prominent leaders, past and present in free South Africa. They allied with the Natal Indian Congress, the Transvaal Indian Congress in 47, that is. Under apartheid, they were considered separately, but still inferior to whites. They begin to ally with other oppressed people of colors as a model. Now, this is a word that was coined during the 50s, negritude, which I'm interpreting as Negroes with attitude, Negroes with tude. Negritude, identity as a black person, especially awareness of a distinct black history and culture is something to be proud of, even though my Encarta dictionary says that it's dated. Where it's dated from is the 50s, right? Because we aren't called Negroes anymore. But as a point of pride, Africans starting in the late 40s and 50s said, okay, negritude is basically taking back our history and our African identity is something to be proud of, to revolt against the colonial memes of racial inferiority. So, I'm going to this is longer than we can cover in the next 7 minutes, but I'm going to start it anyway. So, if you understand that Oregon is a southern state in the Northwest, whenever there's oppression, the natural condition of human beings is freedom. They will fight for freedom. Okay? Eugene and Oregon was founded on racial oppression. So naturally there's going to be a civil rights movement. Right? So talking about the Eugene civil rights movement, there was one. There is one. But most of the discourse is about, the Southern Christian leadership foundation. That is Alabama, Mississippi. But during that same time period in Eugene, the same conditions were happening. Like I said, it's a southern state in the Northwest, right? So, southern state in the Northwest. So, before 1965 was like segregated southern town, where blacks were not allowed to live within the city limits. They could be subject to arrest if on the street after dark, and were not allowed in many businesses, and many businesses actually posted no colored, no Mexicans allowed. Segregated lunch counters at Woolworth and Newberry's. Though today, Newberry's is the DAC Child Care Center, and Woolworth's, where Woolworth's used to be, was now a hole, and is now, they're building that up on the corner of Broadway and Willamette. That used to be Woolworth's. Segregated lunch counters, just like in the South. Southern state. All right? There was an active, before 65, I'm not saying that the Klan doesn't exist, and it has been not active after 65. They have been. And still are. Okay? But before 65, the Ku Klux Klan historically had roots within county and city government, the Elks, the American Legion, Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary Club, and many other institutions in Eugene. They were active. Okay? Thus, there was a need for a civil rights movement, because you had all the conditions of oppression necessarily there. So, for example, this picture of the Ferry Street community, right, from the Oregon Historical Society. So it's captioned, "Children of migrant workers gathering at water pump at the Ferry Street Bridge settlement." Notice that term, settlement. Wait, they come in on a wagon train? What settlement? Why are they settling there? So obviously discrimination is not just happening to black people, but for whites as well. The settlement. Outside of Eugene in 1949. All right, so if you notice, down the center is this water pump. So you have white kids on one side, black kids on the other. Not sure if they staged that or what the context of that photo is, but basically it's pointing out that there are black and white residents at Ferry Street, Tent City. Right? So while it has a reputation as an African American community, certainly the majority of residents were black, but it wasn't all black. Okay, this is the old Ferry Street Bridge in 1949. All right, so before it was, in the 30s, it was a wooden, the 30s and 20s, it was a wooden bridge. In the 19th century, it was simply a ferry that ferried people across the river at that point. This is the steel bridge that succeeded the wooden bridge. You'll see up here, there are basically bean fields. Okay, it's agricultural. And what you'll see down here, see, this is all Alton Baker Park now. Right? What you can't necessarily see, but there are little wooden structures throughout the woods here. Okay? Now, what would happen in the winter is this would flood because there was no dams. Right? So the Ferry Street community was basically built all along here, wooden houses. And let's see what we got next. Right. Okay. So this is the order to vacate. And actually, what I think I'll do is I'll stop here. And we'll take this up more on Wednesday. Did you read this already?